Hello and welcome to Welty at Home, the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. We are currently exploring E.M. Forster's 1908 novel, A Room with a View. During this series, we will read and discuss about 4 chapters each week between now and June 17th, excluding Memorial Day on May 27th. I am Anna Traylor, the education specialist at Eudora Welty House and Garden. We are grateful to Suzanne Mars. Let's see here. Jean, are you meaning to share your screen? There we go. Okay. I am Anna Traylor, the education specialist at Eudora Welty House and Garden. We are grateful to Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer and professor emerita of Millsaps College, for guiding these discussions alongside with our guest instructor, whom Suzanne will introduce for us.
We are really lucky to have with us for these few weeks Kelly Marsh, a professor of English at Mississippi State University. She came to Mississippi via Dartmouth College, where she took her BA, and Penn State University, from which she holds both an MA and a PhD. At MSU, Kelly has taught and continues to teach classes on British and Irish literature, on contemporary literature, on women's literature, and on narrative theory. In 2016, she won Mississippi State's Grisham Master Teacher Award. She is the author of many critical articles and of a recent book titled The Submerged Plot and the Mother's Pleasure, From Jane Austen to Arundhati Roy. Did I pronounce that name correctly, Kelly? In this book, she focuses on submerged plot in which a daughter, and I'll use Kelly's words, seeks validation for her own pleasure in her mother's story. In between discussions of submerged plots in Persuasion and The God of Small Things, Kelly writes about Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, Edith Wharton, Elizabeth Bowen, Alice Walker, Jane Smiley, Dorothy Allison, and Harry Bingham. Clearly, her range of knowledge is impressive, and we are so fortunate that it extends to E.M. Forster. Today, she'll be leading our discussion of A Room with a View. Please welcome Kelly Marsh to the Welty at Home Book Club.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And so nice to see everyone here. I have been teaching at Mississippi State for many years, but I've been on sabbatical this year, working on a new book project. So you see me returning to the pleasure of speaking to a group for the first time since last year at this time. And so I'm really, really pleased to be here and thrilled to have been invited. Thank you very much. I'm sure you're excited to talk about the first 4 chapters of E.M. Forster's A Room with a View, which you read for today, but I know that you're also interested in connections between E.M. Forster and Eudora Welty. So I thought a nice place to start would be with a letter that Forster wrote to Welty early in her career, which meant so much to her that she framed it and put it up on the wall. And it still, as I understand it, hangs on the wall in Eudora Welty's home. So Anna is going to show you a photo of this while I just tell you a little bit about what Eudora Welty said about what this letter meant to her, and then read it for you. So when asked what had Forster meant to her in her work, Eudora Welty talked about, quote, a letter I got from E.M. Forster when I was a beginning writer. I had published a number of short stories, but I wasn't known anywhere. And I received this letter one day where I live in Jackson, Mississippi. It was written in New York City and dated 28 April, 1947. So here's the letter. Dear Miss Welty, finding myself in your country, I feel I should like to give myself the pleasure of writing you a line and telling you how much I enjoy your work, The Wide Net. All the wild and lovely things it brings up have often been with me and delighted me. I'm afraid that I am unlikely to have the good fortune of meeting you while I am over here, since my itinerary keeps me to the north and to the west. Still, there are meetings, which are not precisely personal, and I've had the advantage of one of those through you, and I would like to thank you for it. With kind regards and all good wishes, yours sincerely, E.M. Forster. And she went on to say, the letter was kindness, undreamed of kindness. It was also something that belongs to another realm. It was response. It had been received and had given pleasure. So that was Eudora Welty's first in-person interpersonal interaction with E.M. Forster, but not her last. And Suzanne Mars is going to take it from there on her relation to Forster.
I have to say that when Eudora and I were in that room, we often would look at that letter and she would read that first line, finding myself in your country. And she was always amused by that, as if Forster looked up and went, oh, ho, here I am in your country. So she was very fond of that letter, and she was very fond of Forster. She met him in 1954. This was a meeting not on the page, but in person, when she went to an American Studies conference at Cambridge University in England. And we have two accounts of this in letters. One she wrote to her mother, which we were just now able to see. And to her mother, she wrote, the nicest thing that's happened in Cambridge was Mr. Forster's having me to lunch. He had it Thursday with no other guest and served it in his room at King's College by the fire, and was so very kind and full of good spirits. Then he took me for a walk in the faculty gardens and into the beautiful old chapel there, and up into the organ loft where someone was playing, and we could look down on the chapel below. He was leaving by air for the music festival in Germany next day, and said he should have felt quite cross to have missed me because I hadn't announced myself, and he heard it by accident. It was really so kind and generous of him. He is a wonderful person. And that very night, at a general discussion on literature, that Arthur Meisner had the nerve to say a passage to India was all about nothing in the end. It was ridiculous to be in the position of defending Forster, and made me so mad I couldn't sleep. She wrote to her friend Frank Lyle, who taught English at the University of Texas eventually, about the same event, and she was a little more expansive in telling him about it. She wrote, I had lunch with Forster. He wrote me a note saying he had learned from David Daiches I was in Cambridge and just was about to set off for the continent, and could I have lunch with him in his rooms at King's the last day, which was also the next day, I think. I, of course, had overwhelming feelings of joy, had meant to write and ask if I might wait on him, but had not yet done it. He had all his own things in his rooms, bookcases 2 rows deep. The electric heater was on, for my benefit, I'm sure, because later on I heard him agreeing with the scout that it was quite hot today. Sherry waiting, and the lunch brought in and served on his own little table. Hors d'oeuvres and chops and vegetables and fresh raspberries and cream, white wine, then coffee by the fire. He talked about his family portraits hanging around the room and some letters and papers he had just come into possession of. And when I asked if he might be going to write something about them, he said a sketch was rather in his mind. He asked if the college people attending the conference knew anything about books. They generally don't, he said, and was very kind about what I was up to. He said he hardly saw how he would ever get back to America because of the need, if he came, to lecture and to be put on show, and said the same thing was true of India, where he would very much like to go, but didn't feel he wanted to undergo any more of that. Isn't it sad? After lunch, he put on a jaunty, fat tweed cap with a button on top and took me for a walk. We cut across the grass, ! Then went down into the backs and along the river, then back into the chapel. He showed me over it, and then at the last took me up the winding stair into the organ loft, where a man was playing Handel, I think, but I was having such a lovely time I can't remember exactly. And we looked down into that lovely place from above. He was absolutely darling. As we parted in front of King's, he said, I shouldn't worry for a moment about what to tell them about writing, just tell them to stop it. And then that night, at something called General Discussion Literature, Arthur Meisner oratorically said, "Now you can't go saying Passage to India is a great novel. Come, come. It's simply a novel of manners that's gone wrong. When you finish it, you're left with nothing but a vacuum." I was put in the ridiculous position of having to defend A Passage to India. You know what I think of him, that is Meisner. He regards the conference as a show. That's obvious, and doesn't really care what he's saying so long as people gasp, laugh, defend themselves, get mad, and the rest, all of which I do to my fury. I was so upset after General Discussion Literature that as I was coming home, I literally kicked myself and got in with my foot all covered with blood. Arthur Meisner was not her favorite critic. E.M. Forster was one of her favorite writers. All right. Let me say one little thing. After A Room with a View was available on video, the Merchant and Ivory version of A Room with a View, I loved it. And I said to Eudora, let's watch it together. I thought it'd be so much fun to watch it with her. And she said, no, no, no. She did not want to watch a movie of A Room with a View. That might spoil the book that she loved so much. So we never saw it together. I'll recommend it to you, though. All right, Kelly, back to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. So while we're on Forster, I'll say just a little bit about his life, and then we'll get back to Welty, and then we'll get to the book. Just a few things about his life. He was born in 1879 and died in 1970. So he was 91. And I find it fascinating to think about what he lived through. He was born during the reign of Queen Victoria, and he lived into the reign of Queen Elizabeth. He lived through 2 world wars. He saw the British Empire at its height, and he saw it at its end. He was raised the only child of an upper middle class family. His father was an architect who he lost when he was 2 years old. His father died. So he was raised by his mom and his aunt, and they would remain a very big part of his life through the rest of their lives. He went away to school at Tunbridge, which is close to where Miss Bartlett in A Room with a View lives. And then he went to Cambridge. And as you could already tell from what Suzanne was reading, Cambridge was such a big part of Forster's life for the rest of his life. He became an honorary fellow there. He lived there a lot. His college years are really important. He made great friends, Lytton Strachey, Leonard Woolf, John Maynard Keynes, and other people. He had some important sort of realizations during that time. One was that he had lost his faith and was an atheist. So the rest of his life, he thought of himself as a humanist. He also realized that he was gay. And while his writings, his fiction that included gay characters was not published until after his death, so he was forced to be closeted to that extent. Fortunately, he had a community of friends with whom he could be himself. So those were some of the things that he experienced. The year after he graduated from college, he and his mother traveled in Greece and Italy for nearly a year. And then the 10 years that followed that, he wrote most of his published fiction. Not all, but much. After that, he certainly stayed very much in the public eye as a public intellectual. And he wrote more things, like including the libretto for an opera of Billy Budd and the things for television, et cetera, and radio. But so that's just a little bit about Forster's life. And as you know, Room with a View, 1908. So I thought I'd just come back to Welty for one more minute and then open up with some questions for all of you. When asked what Forster had meant to her in her work, Welty started by talking about the letter. But then she said, but in my work, and she got more specific and said several things. And one of them was, she said this, he must surely have strengthened my recognition of place as a prime source of enlightenment in fiction. He gave me help, not abstract, but directly useful toward identifying place, identifying in place my own most trustworthy teacher. So place as a prime source of enlightenment is something she felt, and that that she felt she connected her to him. She went a little further to say, everywhere that Forster has laid a novel, place meant something specific. And she said, I responded to what he said about those things because I felt the same way, that something can come out of a place, some kind of life, an enduring life, something that receives the experience and holds it. And this anchoring of belief in a place is also connected with a sense of changelessness. So I thought that would be a good place for us to start with a novel called A Room with a View, with a bunch of English characters in Italy. And I also, I had not noticed the thing that Suzanne called attention to, that the first line of the letter is finding myself in your country, which, depending on where we put the stress, could also relate to what's happening to Lucy and the others in A Room with a View. So with the idea that she's thinking about place as a source of enlightenment, place as a kind of a vision of unchangingness that can anchor beliefs, I thought maybe a question we might like to think about is, based on these first few chapters, what does Forster seem to be saying about why we travel? What travel is for, what it does for us. Just let everybody think for a minute, and then I hope people will just unmute and throw in their ideas.
Someone last night suggested I would never call on people if they didn't raise their hands, but of course I will. Anyone want to talk about travel or place? Harriet.
So, as somebody who's an anthropologist's wife and lived in Africa for many years, I think it is about letting go what you know and learning something different. I think it is about having understanding. Welty calls it place. I'm more likely to call it culture. But cultures that are entirely different. We certainly see that in this book, as I'm new to reading A Room with a View. I saw the film years ago, but I think that the notion of English is quite oppressive, and the notion of Italian is something else, something challenging and other.
We have Monica and Pamela and John here lined up.
Also, I'll note it's interesting to read this book because I watch the movie probably once a year and quote it probably once a week. But I have read the novel several times too, but returning to the novel, it's got so much texture compared to the film, which I don't know exactly what I mean by that, but I'm really enjoying it. But when you ask about place, I was thinking about at the end of the section that we read after she and George have seen The Dying Man, and it's on my page 40 in the Penguin Classics, where she says the thought that she, as well as the dying man, had crossed some spiritual boundary. And it seems to me that a lot of this novel is about like finding spiritual boundaries, expanding spiritual boundaries. So I'm thinking about place in terms of like your own psyche as well as a place.
Pamela? Nope.
Bert, my wife's account.
Oh, it's Bear. Ah.
Yeah. But adding on to what Harriet said, going to a different place like this allows you to see other possible ways of living and then to have time to expand out into them. And especially if you're staying in a place as people did in those days, there's just a little more time to interact with people and have that expansion occur. We often don't do that. We get 2 days in each town, like Paris in 2 days, and move on through. And this book especially appealed to me because of the last several years, my wife and I, Pamela, have had the chance to stay in Florence for 2 1-month periods. And so it was exciting to be able to know exactly where she was wandering around in the town and those places that she was going to. It's been a treasure.
Kelly, if you want to chime in at any point.
I'm writing it all down and we'll come in after everybody.
Right, so we've got John and Pearl and Beverly.
Am I want to focus on the travel aspect of the question. When my wife and I became engaged, we were 21 and we got married when we were 22, but we talked to a number of people when we were an undergraduate, a number of people who are married and had been married for some time. And we asked them what they would do, what kind of advice they would give us about being newlyweds. And we were really interested that everybody said, go travel right now, as soon as you get married, as soon as you can, before you have any kids, before you get tied down to a job. And it was almost unanimous that everybody gave us that advice. And we were, after working in a furniture store and a women's clothing store, we were able to go to Europe for 4 months. And on a $5 and $10 budget a day, the Arthur Fromer book, that was the substitute for Baedeker from
Me too, John.
and anyway, it was a great experience, and we were able to continue to do that at different times. And both of my sabbaticals were both in Europe, primarily Europe or England. But it's just it's no substitute, regardless of how good the book is, for being able to be in a country on your own and have your own experiences. But
Pearl?
I think this is one of the joys of reading this book, is that we're all reliving opportunities that we might have had to be in Florence or in Italy. I got out my 1972 guide with 140 photographs of Florence for the 3 days that I was there, and recognized the Arno and got out my map and all of that. But to the idea of place, and I agree with what's being said, I loved reading closely these first 4 chapters, and I have a different version, but she says to Miss Lavish, lively Miss Lavish says, the true Italy is only to be found by patient observation, the opposite of the way she sees Italy, but the way that Lucy does see Italy with her Baedeker. She knows what she wants to go and see, and she's always asking these questions in the first couple chapters. What is the truth and the beauty? What is the relationship? And she wants to find that so badly through this experience. So I mean, I love that. And then a little bit later, Miss Lavish, I think, is still carrying on about her aunt's Suffolk estate. And then this beautiful short sentence, Italy receded, that all of a sudden, where are they? They're just in this Suffolk estate, with Miss Lavish carrying on. So to me, the first chapters really establish this idea for Lucy wants not just to find herself because of what Monica was pointing out at the end of chapter 4, but also to find truth and beauty. And she's been raised to be able to observe. And that's what she's about doing, which is so Welty-like to me.
Beverly? Whoops, you're muted, Beverly. Still muted.
It looks like you don't have your mute button on. There could be audio quality issues that you might be experiencing.
We'll go to Susan and come back.
Okay, well, I mean, I think what I have follows what Pearl just said pretty well. I was looking or thinking about the when Lucy says, Charlotte, don't you feel that we might be in London? when she looks around the pension and sees all these English people and Tennyson hanging on the wall and the Cockney accent of the person who owns it. I mean, it's I think interesting because the characters seem disappointed that they might be in London, and yet also fearful of what Italy might present them with. And most of them seem kind of determined not to change or not to expand the boundaries that you're talking about.
Joellen?
I'd just like to point out that in the 4 chapters we read for today, and we've been touching on this, but there's a gradual expansion of Lucy's perspective, certainly, as Susan says, starting out in the Bertolini. And in that chapter, I thought of her as a British Daisy Miller, if you know James's story. I mean, kind of. But in the second one, in Santa Croce, we have the Emersons highlighted. So she's stepping out. She's learning more about the Emersons and Miss Lavish without Charlotte Bartlett, I think, in that one. And by the end of the chapter, she says something like seeing the whole of life in a new perspective. She's been looking at the artwork. She doesn't know much about it except she likes the babies best. But she's out there looking at it. In music, violets and the letter S, which is hilarious in a lot of ways. There's the focus on music, which Mr. Beebe brings back, which indicates there are 2 kingdoms in Lucy's life, which she is conscious of. And that we have this whole story of her consciousness, becoming conscious of new things. And certainly, and I love the title, 4th chapter, which doesn't give us any clues to what's coming, gives no hints at all. But there, she buys what we learned by the last page is a nude photograph of a knight, along with other art pictures. George sees it. There's blood on them. She witnesses a murder. She faints. There's touch added to the sound of chapter 3. She ends up in his arms, and they both appear to be on quests of a certain kind and have already experienced all kinds of different realms, which are tied to place, I guess.
Bill?
Yeah, just to answer the question about travel a little bit. I mean, there's all kinds of travel. There's travel for work, travel for study, travel as a tourist. And then there's travel on a pilgrimage, if you will. And I've walked pilgrimages, and that's what it seems Lucy was doing in some regards. She had an intention, and then she allowed herself to be distracted by what's really happening around her. And so it's not just place. If we have this image of when I visited Florence, right? This is Florence in 1908 with an Englishman visiting Florence. So it's place and time and the visitor and what's going on at that point, And what's interesting about a place like Florence, which seems kind of eternal, but there's all this daily life that's happening. And that's what struck me about the first times I visited these great European cities, is that they were using their cities like we use our cities to live in. So there's that aspect of life mixed in with this great art. And now what is the great art? It's not the art that strikes me. It's what everybody else has said is supposed to be great, and then just to discover whatever that greatness is for myself is part of the pilgrimage that anybody walks, if you will. So just some thoughts about that. I like this book so far too. It's very good.
Thanks, Bill.
All of this has been so interesting and gives a sense of the range of what Forster has communicated in 40 pages. A lot of the initial comments, he gives us a sense that Lucy is idealistic. She hopes and believes she's going to get to something. And that, for a lot of people, a lot of you who just spoke, touched how you felt when you first traveled to Florence or someplace similar. So he gives us the idea of her idealism, and also he's communicating a comic vision. We can already tell that this is going to come out. This is going to come out well. So we can feel that a lot. But then also some of you noted that he's also doing a pretty steady job of suggesting what the obstacles are to that ideal outcome of travel. Several of them have been mentioned. So I'm thinking, because Bill just spoke, I'm thinking about him saying the difference between experiencing the art for yourself and experiencing what the book says you're supposed to experience. Joellen was saying about the humor of the chapter. That's music, violets, and S. And we should talk about humor. Maybe that should be our next topic. But Joellen had communicated some of the things about these English characters themselves that and their culture that's keeping them from accessing Italy. And I think I said that there's an idealism and that the comic context makes us think they're going to access what they're hoping to access, but we probably should be careful as we keep reading about what they really access. One of you just quoted the true Italy and Italy receded. That was Pearl, I think. Are they going to get to the true Italy? When do we see it? So a couple of you referenced the scene in chapter 4. If this is the first that as readers we hear about Italians, and what is it that we're hearing about them in a chapter that, as Joellen pointed out, doesn't actually have isn't named the way the other chapters are. Why not? What is it? Why the 4th chapter? Why is it called that? And if you look through the table of contents, you'll see there's one more chapter named in a parallel way like that. And once we put those together, I think you'll find that interesting. But what is it that's happening when she finally sees something about Italian life, and somehow it's not describable to her, not or to whom, maybe, is what we should be talking about. So let's see, just to pick up really briefly on other things people said. Oh, I know, Monica talked about spiritual boundaries. And as you probably noticed, boundaries and obstacles keeps coming up, actually keeps being mentioned. And just to remind you, on page 7 of my book, when they're all at dinner, the very first time in the Pension Bertolini, Lucy sees George across the table and he quotes, "seemed to be smiling across something." And then in chapter 4, when Lucy and George both witness a man being killed, the text says, Mr. George Emerson happened to be a few paces away, looking at her across the spot where the man had been. How very odd, across something. That's on page 39 in mine. And then just a few sentences later, he's holding her and it says, not across anything. So I thought that connected with Monica noting that spiritual boundary. Obstacles and what obstacles get overcome seems definitely relevant to the question of travel and what Lucy's doing there and what she's going to accomplish. Sorry that if that felt like a little bit all over the place, but should we talk about the humor a little bit? Because I think the benefit to doing that would be also to get us to what are some of the limitations on these characters that are forming obstacles to them finding the true Italy or finding whatever their goal is about travel. And I think Pearl either has something to say about this or about something from right before.
No, but I want to know your ideas, everyone's ideas about why it's called the 4th chapter now. I don't want to wait till the 12th chapter for that. And to me, I mean, I noticed it right away and was curious about it. And my only guess is that Lucy doesn't know what it means either. And so rather than giving us the foreshadowing that there's going to be real Italians, real life and real death, and all those boundaries crossed with George Emerson, he just says, okay, and then this happened. But I want to know what other people think about why it's just called the 4th chapter. I'm sorry. Then we can go to the humor.
I'm glad you said that because I think, first of all, I think it's very much connected to the humor. And you said already a great start, which is Lucy doesn't know what it means either. So there's meaning, and that's certainly important. All the way through this, she thinks several times about meanings or ideas that are just beyond her reach, or something seemed like it introduced a new thought to her head that she really didn't. So that's totally relevant. And I guess what I would want us to add with the humor is, in addition to not knowing what it means, there are things that can be said and things that can't be said. So if the first chapter is called the Bertolini, we already know that the Bertolini is someplace. These English characters are very comfortable. The Signorina who runs it is actually English. She's from London. The pictures on the wall are of the Queen and Alfred Lord Tennyson. These people are very comfortable here, and it, quote, might be London, as one of you quoted when you were talking before. In Santa Croce with no Baedeker, that, again, that's an experience that Lucy has, that she knows what that means. And also she can articulate that experience. And then you find this point about articulation again in music, violets, and the letter S. So we can talk about music, and we can talk about violets, but the letter S, which, as you know, stands for stomach, that's something you're not supposed to say. So he moves us towards what you can't say. And by the time you get to the fourth chapter, this community doesn't have the language to describe what happened in chapter 4. So that is my theory, and also part of the humor. The reason I'm saying that it's funny here is because he's using their language to show us what's limited about them and also what's funny about them, I think. But I think a lot of people have things to say. I see Harriet and Joellen and Monica.
So I guess my first thought about chapter 4 is that it brings attention to the fictionality of this, to the text, and to the idea. For me, it was saying this chapter is important in a textual way, and so I don't know, but it is hilarious. And the comedy, I'm thinking about. Welty is really wonderful at creating comedy by amalgamating genres. And it looks to me like this book is doing that too, where we have something between a rom-com and a philosophical spiritual novel. And they inform each other, the comedy and the spiritual novel. What else was I thinking? Oh, music. I really felt, and I suspect I'm not the only one, a kind of wallop at how much relationship there is between this novel, as I am entering it, and Welty. And I'm thinking about both the idea of the protected, sheltered daughter. And also the role of music, the Beethoven. I'm thinking right out of the Golden Apple.
On the ruins of Athens.
Yes, it could have been the ruins of Athens, but it wasn't. It was 110 or 112.
111.
111. Okay, somewhere in there. The idea of the passion of music, the idea of which has something to do with what difference between Italy and England and what we can't say. We can't talk about the body. We can't talk about stomach. And all of the conversation about the difference between what is delicate, the things that people say they're indelicate can also be beautiful. And the idea of the body as something that is prohibited in the context of the English, but is of a certain class, but that there is an access to the idea of passion and body and blood and death in Italy. And the problem of George and what George is deciphering what it is that is happening to these two characters in that chapter. We need to do a little background work, I think, on the conversations about George as someone who has hardly learned to speak, and in his father's version of his needing help. So I'll stop there.
Joe Ellen?
I'm just going to toss in a quick thing about chapter 4, because my eye lit on that right away. And I think that in terms of spiritual cycles, they usually run in 3s. And 4th is a number of more stability. And that sounds a little woo-woo and out there, but there is something more solid, and we learn physical, that happens in this chapter. I think the word solid, a more solid world, is used somewhere. But basically, it starts with commentary. Mr. Beebe on Lucy and seeing her desires more clearly after music. In the next couple of paragraphs, or what's being unladylike? Big questions come up in here, in kind of in terms of commentary on what we've witnessed already. Then there's much that is immortal in this medieval lady, pulling together the medieval and Victorian. So all of that happens before we get back into something happened. So anyway, that some associations with the number 4 struck me that way.
Monica?
Well, the 2 things. The 4th chapter, to me, it made me think of the time passes section of To the Lighthouse, of this, like, where the most important things happen are in this unnamed chapter. And thinking of this as like a travel scrapbook, a travel journal, this might be, she isn't going to actually write what actually happened. Spiritual and bodily epiphany is not really something you write in a travel journal for other people to see. But also in terms of the humor, I want to point to Mr. Beebe, and I love both the irony with which he's described and his point of view about things. I mean, it's he who says, right, that if Lucy starts living her life the way that she plays, interesting things will happen. And of course, again, I can't not hear Simon Callow's wonderful voice saying all of these lines. But I think it's interesting when he's introduced on 32, we see him through the Miss Allens, and he's described as, indeed, who would have supposed that tolerance, sympathy, and a sense of humor would inhabit the militant form. So like, it's surprising that the clergyman is actually, interesting and has some kindness to it. And again, he also has the great line about that Lucy's problem is too much Beethoven. That then again, going into chapter 4, it also starts with Mr. Beebe and his observation about Lucy. So I think I love this ironic tone, but also some really kind of wonderful wisdom that gets spoken through Mr. Beebe and his humor.
I was going to say that it seems to me the chapter starts with humor, this talk about the medieval lady, and it ends with the humor of the conception of chivalry. And George wouldn't understand chivalry, so that we've got the framing, the confrontation with mortality. Pearl.
Just want to bring up the irony of the letter S, supposedly because stomach should not be said, because earlier, now this is Forster describing it, but it's real and it fits in with what we're talking about. It says, girls like Lucy were charming to look at, but Mr. Beebe, or is it Beebe or Beebe, was, from rather profound reasons, somewhat chilly in his attitude toward the other sex, and perhaps to be interested rather than enthralled. So in his thoughts, he's not even afraid of saying the word sex or observing these different bodies and what he prefers, but he doesn't want to become enthralled. And yet he's going to be teaching Lucy how to live her life as she should, in a Beethoven type way.
I'll just put in that in the movie Merchant and Ivory, the name is pronounced Beebe, Mr. Beebe. But I don't know if that's their interpretation of the English.
Just real quick, for those listening, if you would like to speak and are unaware of how to use the reactions, you can look at the bottom of your screen, click reactions, and you can raise your hand from there. If you're on a phone, you can tap the screen to make these options appear. I believe, Cecilia, did you want to say something?
Yes. Am I on? I And
Yes, we
I'm
can
new
hear
to
you,
this.
Cecilia. Thank you.
Okay. All right. There were a couple of quotes in chapter 1 that I really, really liked, and I thought I would bring them out. The first one is Mr. Beebe talking about Mr. Emerson, and he says he has the merit, if it is one, of saying exactly what he means. And then he goes on to say, it is so difficult, at least I find it difficult, to understand people who speak the truth. And I thought that was just something out there. And the other one was Lucy when she was talking about Mr. Beebe, and she says, he is nice, exclaimed Lucy. But just what I remember, he seems to see good in everyone. No one would take him for a clergyman. And I thought that one was, they were both just kind of comments on life in general, and I really liked them. So that was really all I had to say.
I'm so glad you did.
Thanks.
Harriet?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of open up the discussion of Mr. Beebe and his role in the novel, because I'm wondering about it. He's introduced to us. I think there's a line that's something like, it's so delightful to advise the newcomer. And he takes that role of giving advice to Lucy, but also to us. I think we trust him because he's good on the Emersons. When he says, these are people who have no manners, not bad manners, no manners. The idea of somehow having escaped the acculturation of being British, and what does that mean? A man who's indelicate but beautiful. But I also notice as we go on that I feel like that Beebe is also English and a clergyman. And he has views that his views of women, his notion of the Emersons, who he tries to integrate into the society of the pension, when he thinks that that Lucy might be taking up the cause, he thinks that he'd rather have them fail than be forwarded by a girl, but they have their cause forwarded by a girl. So I'm wondering about him, just wondering how much I'm going to trust him and how much I'm going to wonder if he's a good guide or not.
Monica?
Yeah, I wanted to point out about Mr. Beebe. There's a line describing him the end of chapter 3 that I'm not quite sure. It's funny. I think that I read this sentence in a variety of tones at the same time. It was one of Mr. Beebe's chief pleasures to provide people with happy memories. And something, first of all, about that sentence. First of all, it resonates. It reminds me of Pride and Prejudice, when Mr. Bennet very sarcastically to Mr. Collins says, "Oh, so you spend time like thinking of compliments to give other people?" And Mr. Collins totally sincerely is like, "Oh yes, I totally do." And it seems like this is kind of, again, you can read this as something positive about Mr. Beebe, but also is a kind of, maybe not criticism, but he's not fully in the mix with everybody else. And it's interesting because the next page, the 4th chapter, we get Lucy reflecting on what Charlotte has taught her about what her role as a woman is. Well, ladies. It's not that ladies were inferior to men, it was that they were different. Their mission was to inspire others to achievement rather than to achieve themselves. So it seems to me that looking at these 2 pages together, that like the clergy and ladies are in some kind of, marginal position, but again, that may be where these, beautiful and delicate things may happen because they're on the margins and maybe other people aren't seeing them.
That's all really interesting. And picking up on Monica saying Mr. Beebe liked to sort of create situations for other people. And another person quoted, maybe it was Monica earlier, but if Miss Honeychurch undertakes to live as she plays, it will be very interesting for all of us. So defining himself. And I think I'm just re-saying again what Monica said, as a spectator. And I would say maybe most relevant for this book, a tourist. He's not here to get involved. He's watching. And so that might be where some of Harriet's hesitation is coming from. Like, there's lots of things to like about him, but there's something, and it's a holding back. It's a reserve. Monica quoted about Mr. Collins. I'm thinking about Jane Fairfax from Emma. Someone so suspiciously reserved, you can hang out with her, but you can't really be friends with her. And so I don't know, maybe that's how I feel about Mr. Beebe a little bit. Cecilia's quotes from chapter 1 are the first two on my list about the humor of the novel, where Lucy just unselfconsciously says he doesn't seem like a clergyman at all. He's just way too nice, obviously. And Mr. Beebe saying, yeah, somebody who speaks the truth is likely to confuse you. So the characters themselves say funny things, but of course that is a function of the narrator. And to add to that, I would, in our whole sense of humor, and we've brought up the word irony before, and kind of and again, so I thought we would talk just for a second about the humor that the narrator brings. And this also relates to our interest in the chapter titles, because it's the narrator who's entitling the chapters. But I thought it would probably be worth it to take a look at, so my point is here that there's things the characters say, like the things that Cecilia quoted, or Miss Allen not being able to say the word stomach in front of a man, or using the word a pity instead of saying a nude statue or picture of a statue. But then the narrator is also saying things sort of like this. And so we should probably just look at a couple of examples just so that we make sure that we're really hearing this narrator. And I thought really early on, page 4. So again, my point is the characters are saying things that are funny, but the narrator is part of this too. So this is page 4 in my book, just the second page of the novel. And the paragraph starts, Miss Bartlett was startled. And the next sentence is, generally, at a pension, people looked them over for a day or two before speaking, and often did not find out that they would do till they had gone. So this is the narrator, but speaking in Charlotte's language, and even speaking in the language of all of these characters by putting the word do in quotation marks. And so this is the narrator taking on their voice to let us see both what's funny about them, but also what's limiting them, what's keeping them from embracing the full ideal of travel, which is they're missing things. They're even missing each other. Bill had said, or no, Gilbert had said, when the way that they're traveling, which is staying in a pension, meaning they're staying there, but not just like in a hotel, not even like a bed and breakfast, but eating maybe all their meals there or most of them. They're interacting so much, but they're not even always really hearing each other or really seeing each other. And then just further down that same page, after a little bit of dialogue, the better class of tourist was shocked at this. And again, so this is the narrator, but he is speaking in their language, but with a slight ironic distance, which is helping us see both what's funny about them and also what is giving us a little bit of ironic distance so we can see what's keeping them from their goals. And since we're getting close to the end of the hour, not to end things, but I thought it might be useful to come back to something we were just talking about, which is, well, a couple things. So we're interested in chapter 4, seeing this violent scene. What does it do? What does it mean? There was an indication somewhere that this is an epiphanic scene. I think for George, it probably is. He has felt depressed. He's felt, as one of you put in the chat, I haven't seen all the chat, but I've seen a little bit of it. He has, in the pension room that he was staying in, there's a big question mark on the wall. He is wondering, what is this life and is it worthwhile? And to him, it seems like to see bloodshed, to see someone's life go out so quickly, that is an epiphany. I think I shall want to live, he says, but I'm not sure that we could say that Lucy's there yet. What she's primarily worried about in chapter 4 is what people will think about the fact that she's alone in this place with George. So even though she has seen this life and death thing, at least for the moment, she is not out from under. What she primarily is doing is trying to get away from him. She sends him out to get her photos in the square so that she can get away and walk back to the pension by herself without him accompanying her. She's trying to get rid of him so that she can save her reputation, so that people won't be talking to her. So she's not there yet. And so again, that might be why we're waiting for chapter 12, or what we might that paired chapter, which, as one of you pointed out, certainly has something also something that numerologically seems relevant as well. 4 and 12. Laura?
Yeah, I was thinking about that same section with the postcards, especially because that's such a classic tourist experience. We want to, we want to go, and I thought that was so interesting with Lucy, because it was so bold that she went out. It was the Beethoven, and she was so bold to go out on her own. And she, in a way, she finds that authentic Italy that Miss Ladish was looking for. And she has this sort of, she confronts, what she's trying to sort out what she thinks of Italy, what she should see, what Ruskin tells her is important to see in Santa Croce, all of these things. And she sort of, I feel like she's getting a grip of that when she picks out her photographs in Alinari. And she's saying, okay, this is important, this is important, this is Italy, this is Italy. She's building Italy, and then she goes out, and then she's confronted with an actual authentic Italy experience. and literally her postcards, the things that she was building Italy of, are covered in blood. And I just really thought that was speaks to earlier, I believe you were saying that these are the things that she can't put into words yet, but I love that visual representation of that sort of confrontation of authentic Italy. She finds it, but she doesn't know what to do with it yet.
Sure, Will.
I just want to make a distinction about George and Lucy in chapter 4. While their social responses are not there yet, they both clearly are conscious that something has happened. We can make some pretty good guesses about it, but it's not been entirely spelled out. But they've been outside the pension, and the world has changed a little bit. They're going to try to hide that, of course, when they get back. But
Harriet.
I'm thinking back to the scene in which Mr. Emerson is explaining the problem with George, and he talks about his George feeling the old trouble, things won't fit. We know that we come from the winds and that we shall return to them, and that all life is perhaps a knot, a tangle, a blemish in the internal smoothness. But why should this make us unhappy? Let us rather love one another. I'm thinking about Mr. Emerson is somebody who is not terribly articulate, and yet he's beautiful. His language is beautiful. He's talking about this knot, tangle, blemish, things not fitting, the things of the universe. I think we're talking about meaning and death and what I think is dramatized for George in the scene, and the fact that he throws away her photographs, one, really disturbed me, and two, made a sense in terms of, I think, his being kind of whipped back and forth in that scene, that he is it happens that the photograph, maybe he's not seen it, but we have. We know it's the Botticelli Venus, and there is, and Lucy has come to it from playing Beethoven, feeling as if she wants to rebel, going out and buying these photographs, so I see him being bewildered, not knowing what to do with the blood, and so he casts it away, even though he knows that something is valuable to Lucy, and then he says, And so, and maybe I got the line wrong, but, and so I will live, or choose life. That something definitive has happened for him in this moment and encounter. And it has to do with not being disturbed by the fact of death. It's a choice to live. That sounds very much like Mr. Emerson saying, let's love and don't be disturbed by it. Make that choice.
Earl?
I love with these photographs or these postcards, and back to the Botticelli, she says, Venus being a pity, as you said, it was for nude, spoiled the picture, otherwise so charming. And that's the narrator saying what her responses are to come back to that point. But then very quickly she says, but though she spent nearly 7 lira, something absolute and practical, and you can put your finger on it, the gates of liberty still seemed unopened. But then right away, the next paragraph at the end, it seems to me very much like Hawthorne's Custom House chapter to the Scarlet Letter. It was the hour of unreality, the hour that is when unfamiliar things are real. The older person at such an hour and in such a place might think that sufficient was happening to him and rest content. Lucy desired more. And then she does get more. And to Harriet's conclusion about Mr. Emerson, what he says is at the end of 4th chapter, I shall probably want to live.
Yeah.
There's that, I don't know if that's what tense that is, but anyway, but why, Mr. Emerson? What do you mean? I mean, she can't really even understand that, even though she's seen life and now she's seen death. But he shall want to live. I shall want to live, I say. Not so he gets rid of the probably. I shall want to live. But what that means is we don't know yet.
Well, all right. Thank you guys so much. It's 1 o'clock, so we have one more comment. If we could wrap up right after that.
So we'll let Bill speak and Kelly, and then we'll wrap up, shall we?
Yeah. Mhm.
Oh, Bill.
Well, I wish I had something profound to say, but I've just been thinking about the 4th chapter. What's that mean? How would I title it? But what was interesting, that a pity in art, of course, signified the nude. And then she says, or thinks, a lot of this is stream of consciousness, if you will, of her towards the end of the chapter. She says, but he lacked chivalry. His thoughts, like his behavior, would not be modified by awe. It was useless to say to him, and would you, and hope that he would complete the sentence for himself, averting his eyes from her nakedness. Her nakedness. Where is she naked in this? She's vulnerable, I assume is what she means by her nakedness here. But the way she's built, the way he writes this, the way she builds it up in her own mind, she doesn't want to be the eternal woman. She wants to just go someplace as her transitory self. And then she has that. Nothing ever happens to me. Then something did happen. And she promptly faints, right? And he comes to her rescue, but he's not chivalrous. He doesn't keep the real thing, the blood, on those beautiful photos. Somehow or another, they think that ruins it. If I happen to witness a scene like that, and my postcards were covered with the blood of the murdered victim, I would put them in a nice, safe place and bring them home, because that's more memorable to me than anything else. But I don't know what I would call this. I think there was just so much in here. I like the triple cave entrance. I thought that would be a nice title for this. That comes in the where the loggia showed as a triple entrance of a cave, wherein many a deity, shadowy but immortal, looked forth upon the arrivals and departures of mankind. It was the hour of unreality, the hour that is when unfamiliar things are real. An older person, such an hour in such a place, might think that sufficient was happening to him and rest content. Lucy desired more, and she gets a murder.
I have to say, Bill, I'd be getting rid of those postcards.
Not me.
Okay, Kelly.
And just to pick up on the last thing that Bill said, she gets more and she feels responsible. She wakes up from her faint and says, what have I done? As if she has caused this by wishing for more. But just to think ahead towards next week, I guess we're trying to think as we read, to what extent does Lucy access the true Italy? To what extent does she, quote, find myself in your country? Or is there something else, something besides Italy, something besides herself? What else does she find? And that probably we'll need to talk more about the Emersons in order to access that third thing.
I also want to talk about the Emerson's name and the allusion to Carlyle. So
Really enjoyed it. Thanks for a great discussion.
thank you, Kelly. See you all next week.
Thank you all so much.